You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 338, Adams Goes to London. This week, we're going to take a look at diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Europe after the Revolutionary War. The big issue for the United States was trade. Under the colonial system, major powers generally allowed only trade between their own colonies and the mother country. This was known as mercantilism. Trade rules were regularly set up to benefit the mother country, who got a monopoly on raw materials from the colonies and had a monopoly selling finished goods back to them. When the American colonies had been part of the British system, they were free to trade within that system. As independent states, Britain had largely cut them out of trade. British ships still came to America with goods to sell, but Britain largely blocked or placed heavy tariffs on American exports to Britain. During the years leading up to the Revolutionary War, British merchants, upset by various trade boycotts by the colonies, began finding other sources for raw materials and were able to operate largely without American resources. Many officials in London deliberately sought a policy of punishing the U.S. for leaving the British Empire and the numerous trade benefits that went along with it. The Continental Congress had created the Office of Secretary for Foreign Affairs back in 1780, but they didn't actually fill that job until a year later. Robert Livingston of New York took the job around the same time that the British were surrendering at Yorktown in late 1781. In that role, Livingston found himself acting pretty much as a secretary. He was handling correspondence with the peace commissioners in Paris and trying to keep Congress up to date with what was happening, but he really didn't have any role in making foreign policy. Livingston found the role frustrating and powerless. It also did not pay him enough even to cover his expenses. At the time, Livingston was also Chancellor of New York. In December of 1782, local political opponents in New York were trying to remove him as Chancellor, arguing that he could not hold both jobs at the same time. In response, Livingston tendered his resignation as Secretary for Foreign Affairs. The timing of the resignation was not a good one. This was a critical time since the commissioners were in the process of concluding the preliminary peace treaty with Britain around this same time. Several members of Congress begged Livingston to stay on, so he agreed to remain until May of 1783, but he did have to return to New York for a short time to attend to his duties as Chancellor. He hung around for a few months after that, finally leaving the position sometime during the summer of 1783. Despite being in the middle of negotiations over the final peace treaty, Congress left the position unfilled when Livingston left. The following year, on receiving word that John Jay was returning to Paris after having concluded the peace treaty, Congress appointed him to serve as the new Secretary for Foreign Affairs. Jay received notification of his appointment 2 months later when he returned to America in July of 1784. Jay was not particularly interested in the job, though. He had private matters to attend to in New York. He was also considering running to replace George Clinton as governor of New York. In the end, the New York legislature appointed Jay as a delegate to the Continental Congress. So Jay did go to Trenton, but in that capacity, not considering the office of secretary. After a couple of months, probably after seeing the mess that Congress had made of the Foreign Affairs Department, Jay finally agreed to serve as secretary beginning in December 1784. It could be that Jay had found the position more palatable, since Congress was moving to his hometown of New York City in early 1785. Jay seemed to spend most of his time working with his clerks, trying to organize the department's papers, making sure that critical diplomatic correspondence of the peace treaty was organized and preserved. Jay handled all foreign correspondence on behalf of the government, but with the war over, and with efforts to establish other treaties in Europe largely stalled, there wasn't even that much correspondence. Even Congress itself was doing pretty little at this time. It struggled to gather a quorum most of the time. Congress had appointed John Hancock to return to the presidency in late 1785. Hancock, however, was suffering various ailments, and he never even left Boston for New York, and ended up resigning about 6 months later, in 1786, without even ever having left home. Following Hancock's resignation, Nathaniel Gorham became president of Congress. As I said, with the war over, Americans showed little interest in foreign affairs, or even for the Continental Congress for that matter. Parochial state interests were the main focus of anyone who showed any interest in government at all, and Americans had generally no interest in European relations. Francis Dana, who had actually served as minister to Russia during the war and had returned to Congress in 1784, wrote to John Adams that he opposed having any American ministers in Europe. They just cost money that America didn't have. Dana also feared that foreign countries would respond by sending ministers to America and would simply get America involved more in the intrigues of Europe. With the war over, Americans like Dana were content to keep the Atlantic Ocean as a great divide and simply ignore the affairs happening an ocean away. And certainly Dana was not unique in this position. Elbridge Gerry, who was also serving in Continental Congress at the time, wrote to Adams with very similar sentiments. Adams personally recognized the importance of foreign policy. He had originally planned to return home after the Treaty of Paris had been finalized, but recognizing that this was a longer-term appointment and that he was going to stay, Adams finally convinced his wife Abigail and his daughter Nabby to join him and his 2 sons in Europe. Abigail leased out all their properties in Massachusetts, leaving her home in the care of a woman named Phoebe Aldy. Phoebe had been a slave of Abigail's father, William Smith. When William died in 1783, Phoebe was freed in his will. She had recently married a freeman named William Aldy. Abigail trusted her home to the newlywed couple, and in the summer of 1784, Abigail and Nabby, along with 2 servants and a cow, set sail for London. Upon her arrival, Abigail learned that John was still in The Hague, trying to manage some financial matters. She wrote to him to announce her arrival. Adams had to remain in The Hague for a short time, but sent their son, John Quincy Adams, to meet them. A couple of weeks later, John also arrived, but then took the whole family to Paris to deal with other diplomatic matters. The Adamses had been apart for quite some time. John Quincy had left with his father in 1780 as a 10-year-old boy, and met his mother, again for the first time since then, as a 17-year-old man. When the family traveled to Paris, they met with the other ministers who were there. Benjamin Franklin was still there, as was Thomas Jefferson, who was expected to replace Franklin as minister to France at some point when Franklin returned home. While Americans seem to have lost interest in foreign affairs, Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson did remain pretty busy. And one big issue for them was not so much diplomatic as it was financial, specifically managing debt. All of those desperate loans taken during the war had to be repaid now that the war was over. France, dealing with its own war debts, was pushing hard for repayment of the loans it had made to America. Since neither France nor any other European power had any continuing interest in underwriting the government in America, the only place that could continue to provide loans was private bankers in the Netherlands. Adams and the others were essentially just taking out more loans so that they could pay interest on the old loans. If America failed to meet its payments, then it would be possible to get any additional loans and the whole thing was going to collapse. So finances played a really important role for the diplomats during this time. Now, of course, finances weren't the only issue. Another big issue that developed around this time was with the Barbary States. During the Revolutionary War, American shipping had the tacit protection of the French Navy. Barbary States left American shipping alone. When the war ended, American vessels no longer had any protection. Now, for centuries, these North African states had made a living by capturing and ransoming foreign shipping. Most European powers had established agreements that would protect their own shipping in exchange for an annual payment to these states or through the threat of retaliations by their very large navies. The U.S., however, had no such financial deal and had no such navy to threaten these would-be attackers. In October of 1784, Moroccan ships seized the Betsy, an American merchant ship. It took several months for the news to arrive that the ship and crew were being held for ransom. Now, the American diplomats didn't have a formal relationship with Spain, but Spain did have a good relationship with Morocco, and they convinced the Spanish officials to negotiate to release the crew. The crew was released, but with that came the message that the Americans needed to send their own envoy to Morocco with presents for the emperor. Otherwise, future crews would probably be treated much more harshly. Jefferson sent an envoy to Morocco. The problem was there wasn't much to negotiate. As I said, the U.S. had no navy, having sold off its ships at the end of the war, so it couldn't really threaten the emperor or his forces. Further, the cash-strapped Americans could not afford to pay any annual tribute that was demanded by the Moroccan emperor. While these negotiations were ongoing, the situation got worse when neighboring Algeria captured two American schooners, the Maria and the Dauphin, in the summer of 1785. Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli were semi-independent provinces that were affiliated with the Ottoman Empire. Along with Morocco, these provinces made a living by capturing ships for ransom or collecting tribute from countries that wanted their shipping left alone. The Barbary negotiators met with the U.S. negotiators and demanded about $2.6 million in order to return the ships and establish a treaty with the United States. The American negotiators had received authorization from Congress to spend up to $40,000 to come to an acceptable peace with these groups. While the negotiations continued, the crews of the captured sailors were enslaved and placed on starvation diets. The American negotiators had to use part of the $40,000 allocation from Congress just to provide food for these enslaved crews. After these attacks, most American shipping simply avoided the region. Insurance rates made it nearly impossible to do business in the area. Pirates ended up capturing several more ships, though, off the coast of Portugal. After more than a year of negotiations, in 1786, the U.S. was able to establish a treaty with Morocco, but not with the other three provinces. The American sailors would remain in slavery for more than a decade. Also in 1786, Jefferson and Adams met personally with the Tripoli ambassador in London, Sidi Haji Abdurrahman. The minister was unapologetic for the attacks on American shipping. Citing the Quran, the minister argued that all unbelievers in the Prophet Muhammad were subject to capture and enslavement. The only way for the attacks to end would be the payment of ransom and tribute that the Americans did not have. Negotiations with the Barbary provinces were ongoing, while the American diplomats in Europe struggled to secure other treaties as well. Now, Adams did manage to secure trade agreements with Prussia and Sweden, but those countries had very little economic impact. Trade with France was somewhat open, in part thanks to the work of Lafayette, but again not providing much in the way of economic opportunity for American traders. Everyone knew that trade with Britain was the key to a return of a successful trade that existed before the war. Britain had debated granting the U.S. broader trading status in hopes of restoring a closer relationship with its former colonies, but the majority of the British government wanted to exclude the U.S. from trade as a way of teaching the Americans that independence came with a price. While British merchant ships happily sold goods to the Americans, American merchant ships were largely blocked from entering British ports. There were also other issues that continued to separate Britain and the U.S. The British Army still occupied outposts in the Northwest Territory, in violation of the Treaty of Paris. Americans still complained of the slaves and other property that the British removed from the continent, also in violation of the peace treaty. In response, Britain complained that the treaty also promised reimbursement to Tories who had their property confiscated, and nothing was happening with that either. America had to establish an ambassador to Britain to negotiate these and other matters. The question was, who would be the ambassador? Adams seemed to want the role, but he had his detractors in Congress. One of the leading detractors was our old friend Arthur Lee, who had been a longtime critic of any foreign ambassador who was not himself. Adams also had his detractors on the other side of the political spectrum because of his past conflicts with men like Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane, who still had their own allies in Congress. Many delegates also feared that Adams's anti-slavery sentiments would prevent him from negotiating the return of stolen slaves. Adams didn't help his case by sending a letter to then-Secretary Livingston outlining his qualifications for the job. Opponents saw this as vanity and that a man who was too full of himself to represent the U.S. British officials would just play on that vanity and prevent him from promoting U.S. interests effectively. In the end, though, congressional debate focused on Adams as well as John Rutledge of South Carolina. Rutledge, as you may recall, had been governor of South Carolina during much of the war and had also served in the Continental Congress, which is where he had been serving shortly after the war. He then had taken a position as head of the South Carolina Court of Chancery. Now, Rutledge very quickly became the favorite among Southern delegates. Other states were somewhat skeptical of New Englanders, or Adams personally, and this made the race a difficult one. And during these debates, a third choice also arose. Late in the game, Robert Livingston, the former Secretary for Foreign Affairs and currently Chancellor of New York, also came under close consideration. Livingston, being from New York, got a lot of support from the Middle Colonies. Now, despite some personal dislike of Adams and distrust of New Englanders, Adams's years of experience in Europe convinced the majority of delegates to support him in the end. John Jay, the Secretary for Foreign Affairs, had worked alongside Adams in helping to create the final peace treaty that ended the war, and Jay lent his support to Adams. In the final vote, 9 states supported the motion to send Adams to the Court of St. James in London. Having received word of his appointment, Adams prepared to move his family from Paris to London. His son, John Quincy, around this time returned to America to take up studies at Harvard. The rest of the family crossed the Channel in late May 1785. On June 1st, days after his arrival, Adams presented his credentials to King George III. Now, the meeting could have been an awkward one. After all, Adams spent the previous decade calling the king a tyrant, while the king saw this colonial upstart as a traitor who likely would have been hanged for his actions under other circumstances. That said, both men were focused on improving relations between their two countries at this point. Adams expressed a, quote, desire to cultivate the most friendly and liberal intercourse between your Majesty's subjects and their citizens. The king responded to Adams, I was the last to consent to the separation. But the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I have always said, as I say now, that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power. Let the circumstances of language, religion, and blood have their natural and full effect. After these formal comments, the king chatted up Adams, commenting that even though he had spent quite some time in France, that he had heard that Adams was not a big fan of the French. Adams simply responded that he had no attachment but to my own country. The king responded, quote, an honest man will never have any other. The next day, Adams was in court again, along with all the other ambassadors, to celebrate the king's birthday. Once again, Adams and the king struck up a conversation and seemed to be getting along quite well. Now, despite hitting it off with the king, Adams had to wait weeks before getting an audience with the British Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Lord Carmarthen. Congress had instructed Adams to press the government on issues of trade, the return of slaves, and the removal of British forces from the Northwest Territory. When he finally did get the meeting, Adams made the argument to Lord Carmarthen that opening British ports to U.S. trade would allow merchants to get the money that was required to repay the British merchants for their pre-war debts. So would the repayment of stolen property by the British Army. Allowing Americans to move into the Northwest Territory would also improve the U.S. economy. If Britain wanted its debts to be repaid by the Americans, it was going to have to allow the U.S. to make some money. Carmarthen listened politely to Adams's concerns and asked that they be put in writing, but the British minister was non-committal and refused to put forward any possible resolution to these issues. With little movement on diplomatic issues, the Adams settled into a rented house on Grosvenor Square in London. Across the street lived a former Prime Minister, Lord North. Two men who sought the destruction of each other for so many years now found themselves to be neighbors. The Adams hired a domestic staff and received visitors regularly. The following summer, Jefferson visited Adams in London. It was during this time that the two men met with the Tripoli ambassador, as I discussed earlier, and Adams spent much of his time visiting the English countryside as well as various historical sites around the country. While Adams's time in Britain was a pleasant one for him and his family, he never reached any resolution with the British government on the issues that separated the two countries. Britain and the United States could not establish a treaty on trade issues, and the issues over reimbursements for Patriot slaves or Tory property would never be resolved to anyone's satisfaction. Adams spent 3 years in London, patiently working on the issues, but to no avail. Finally, in 1788, after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia increased his desire to return home and get more involved in domestic politics, Adams departed London and left for home. Next week, we return to the southern U.S. as officials make treaties with the Cherokee and begin westward movement in that part of the country. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Salentano, and Michael Mulhern. And thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Patrick LeBeau and Kurt Avard. I also want to thank Sean Dawson, who joined as a standard bearer last month. And finally, thanks to Curtis Johnson, who is not only a Morris Circle supporter, but also made an additional one-time gift via PayPal last month. I really am grateful for everyone who supports this podcast and allows me to continue with this project. I also want to mention that this week, if you're listening to the podcast in real time, on Wednesday, we will be holding our roundtable discussion on Zoom. The topic this month is Saratoga, and we have an author who will be joining us for the subject. I try to hold these negotiations every month on the second Wednesday. If you want to join me on Zoom this week, you can email me. I will send you the Zoom link. If you want to be made aware of future events, please be sure to be on my mailing list, and you can participate in future live Zoom events. Now, this week we looked at U.S. diplomatic efforts following the war. Now, in some ways, the U.S. was lucky to have the Atlantic Ocean to protect them from all the threats that Europe might have caused them. But that also cut two ways. The U.S. had trouble exerting any power abroad. As a result, the European powers felt free to ignore the U.S. and pretty much anything it wanted. The U.S. would have to prove itself to be a power in the future. The quasi-war with France was the first real effort outside of a few conflicts with Indians, where the U.S. began to assert itself militarily with other major powers. The next big international conflict for the U.S. would be a continuation of something else that we covered this week, the Barbary Coast. Jefferson would end up spending the rest of his time in France trying to reach some agreement with the leaders of these North African forces that continued to attack U.S. shipping. He really didn't get much of anywhere because, as I said, he had neither the money nor the power. Once the U.S. adopted the Constitution and had a little money, the Washington administration would make some payments to get the enslaved crew members home. Jefferson was very much against this. He did not want to set the precedent of paying ransom for what he regarded as criminal piracy. President Washington overruled him, and the prisoners came home. Some had suffered for more than a decade in Algeria. Now, of course, when Jefferson became president, he opted against making payments, and he sent in the Marines to clear out these pirates. That's where we get the "From the Shores of Tripoli" in the Marine hymn. Of course, Washington didn't have a navy to send to Africa, so that wasn't an option for him. Congress could not begin funding a navy until after the Constitution made some money available, and once that money was available, it took years to build it up into a proper navy. Efforts to establish a better relationship with Britain took even longer. The two countries, of course, would fight a second war in 1812, and they continued to have conflicts for decades after that. It really wasn't until the middle of the 18th century before the two countries began to really get along well, and it wasn't until World War I that the two fought on the same side as allies. Today we think of Britain and the U.S. as the closest of allies, but it took a long time to get there. Both Jefferson and Adams remained overseas for the next few years. As such, both of them missed the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Both men were well aware of it and sent letters to friends who did attend, hoping to influence events. After the Constitution entered the ratification phase, both men returned home. Adams left Britain and returned to Massachusetts in 1788. Jefferson remained in France a while longer, returning in 1789, shortly after the outbreak of the French Revolution. Jefferson left France about a month before the first elections under the Constitution, so it's understandable why it took 7 months for the new government under President Washington to appoint a replacement ambassador to France. William Short, Jefferson's replacement, had been in France and was Jefferson's assistant, so he kept up diplomatic relations in an unofficial capacity until he received that appointment months later. The situation in Britain was very different. As I said, Adams left in 1788, and it would take more than 4 years for the U.S. to get around to appointing Thomas Pinckney as his replacement. When Pinckney left for London in 1792, he faced many of the very same issues that Adams had left behind. Trade was still a mess, British soldiers still occupied parts of the Northwest Territory, and no one on either side was getting paid for past wrongs from the Revolutionary War. And Pinckney did no better than Adams in resolving these things. 4 years after Pinckney arrived, John Jay also arrived as a special envoy, leading to what became known as the Jay Treaty, which was a very unpopular treaty in the U.S. And hopefully at some point we'll get into more about that in a future episode. But international diplomacy was a game that the U.S. was still learning, and it needed much more experience before it could play that game well. My book recommendation this week is A View from Abroad, The Story of John and Abigail Adams in Europe by Gene Abrams. This is a close look at early U.S. diplomacy after the Revolution from the perspective of John Adams. It's a relatively short book at only about 200 pages, but it really focuses on the time period that we covered this week. The author, Gene Abrams, is a history professor emeritus at the University of Denver. She retired last year. Her book on the Adamses in Europe was published in 2021. So if this topic interests you, get a copy of A View from Abroad, The Story of John and Abigail Adams in Europe. If you want a more general overview, you may like my online recommendation. It's an older book called Foreign Policies of the Founding Fathers by Paul Varg. This is a more general look at how the U.S. foreign policy formed during the Revolutionary War and over the next couple of decades. This is an older book. It was first published in 1963. However, it does not appear to be under copyright any longer and is freely available for download on archive.org. Foreign Policies of the Founding Fathers. As always, I've included direct links to the book on my blog and website. My question this week asks, what is the story behind daylight savings time? I heard that it was Benjamin Franklin's idea. So where did he arrive at this great idea? Well, Benjamin Franklin did not suggest people adjust their clocks by an hour twice each year. Credit is generally given to Franklin based on a 1784 article that he wrote in Paris, suggesting that they would waste fewer candles and firewood if people got up closer to dawn and went to bed closer to dusk. As with most of Franklin's writings, this article was meant to be humorous. He was well known in France for going to parties very late into the night and then sleeping until midday. His article notes that he happened to wake up at 6 a.m. one morning and was just shocked to see that his room was filled with light from the morning sun. He went on to talk about this marvelous discovery of morning daylight as if he was the first person in the world to realize that this happened. He then went on to calculate the number of candles burned in Paris every night based on the population and based on the cost of candles, calculated that the people could save over 96 million livres per year simply by getting up early and going to bed early, or as he put it many years earlier, early to bed, early to rise. His article then went on to suggest that the city of Paris should ring bells and fire cannons in the morning to wake up everyone at dawn. He also suggested further efforts to prevent the waste by rationing how many candles could be sold each week and placing a tax on shutters that would keep out the morning sun. He also wanted to place guards to prevent coaches from traveling at night. As I said, a lot of this was just meant to be satire. Franklin continued to party late into the night and sleep in all morning. He knew full well that most working people already had to rise at dawn and went to sleep early in the evening. But none of this really has anything to do with daylight savings time. In Franklin's time, the world did not have 1-hour time zones at all. Time was set wherever you were by setting noon when the sun was directly overhead. As a result, each locality had its own time based on the position of the sun, and there were thousands of them. Standard time zones were implemented in the late 19th century as part of the effort to make train schedules simpler. Once the zones were in place, the idea of shifting those times for more summer light goes to George Hudson, a New Zealand entomologist who made that suggestion in 1895. Now, several European powers first implemented time changes during World War I in order to save energy, and the U.S. adopted the practice shortly after its entry into World War I. Part of the effort to get it adopted by the public was that politicians threw around the idea that Benjamin Franklin had invented it. It was not particularly popular, and when the war ended, Congress repealed daylight savings time, even overriding President Woodrow Wilson's veto to do so. After that, various states and localities adopted different schedules for turning the clocks back. President Franklin Roosevelt adopted a national standard again during World War II, calling it wartime. But when the war ended, so did the federal mandate. Dates for daylight savings time reverted to state and local law. Daylight savings time did not become standardized until passage of a federal law, the Uniform Time Act of 1966. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.